All right, everybody, let's get to it and pull that tarp. My guest today is Emily Jabbour. Emily is the councilperson at large for the beautiful city of Hoboken, New Jersey. Welcome to Everybody Pulls the Tarp, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so let's get right into it. But before we dive in, we have people from more than 60 different countries who listen to Everybody Pulls the Tarp. So let's start by telling everybody who's listening and watching who doesn't know where Hoboken, New Jersey is. Where's Hoboken?
Sure. You can find Hoboken right across the river from Manhattan. We're actually closer than Staten Island is to Manhattan. So we sometimes think of ourselves as the sixth borough, but we are nestled in on the Hudson River. And the census data, updated census data, tells us we're about 60,000, a city of 60,000 people, but we're in 1 square mile. It's a really unique city because we are geographically very limited. So those 60,000 people all live in 1 square mile.
It's an interesting city with a lot of passionate people, that's for sure. I grew up in New Jersey, which many of my listeners and viewers know. Hoboken is always a cool place to me. My brother spent some time in Hoboken after college. What a really, really cool place, Emily. So let's talk about your role. So you multitask all the time. You always have different things going on. But just a couple of years ago, you decided to throw your hat in the ring and run for public office. You ran for councilperson in the city of Hoboken. For my listeners, what is the role of a councilperson in a city like Hoboken?
Sure. So I decided to run. I was getting more involved with the city for different reasons. I had 2 little kids who were entering the public school system. I was just kind of getting more involved with community events. And I realized that there was this opportunity to be a voice within the community for someone with a perspective like mine, being a mom of young kids, caring about social issues. This was on the heels of the presidential election when President Trump was elected. And I think there was a strong sense of civic engagement on the more progressive agenda. And so I had this sensibility that, I felt like more women needed to start getting involved at all levels of government. And so I decided to kind of put my hand up and get more involved and run for office as part of the legislative body. We are a strong mayor form of government in Hoboken. So we do have the mayor's role in things, and then the city council really is the legislative body that authorizes and signs off on the work that comes out of the administration. And there's 9 of us total, so I'm one of 9.
It's very interesting because so much of the attention, always is placed on the federal government and the activity there. But so many things that people, utilize every day and engage with every day is really set up, facilitated, and managed by local government. Talk about that for a moment.
Absolutely. And I have kind of a unique perspective because my day job, I actually work full-time for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So I have a really strong sense of what it means to be at the federal government, to your point. But that's 10,000 feet above kind of where people's daily lives are. So it's an incredibly interesting thing to now be on the municipal level and deal with things like the aggravation of a pothole on your block or whether trash is being picked up on time. It's kind of mundane. I get it. But it's also really essential to the daily life of people, especially when we're talking about a COVID sort of, where we are with COVID life, because you're probably home more than you've ever been before. And so it's this hyper local sense of how do I have an impact on my community? And, it doesn't always take having to be involved in a national advocacy organization. Sometimes it just means raising your hand and going to a community meeting locally to have a voice about that project or a new building that's going in down the block. Because that does make a huge difference in your everyday life. It really shapes your community.
This show, Emily, is called Everybody Pulls the Tarp. And the point you just made there is one of the many reasons why I wanted to sit down and have a conversation with you, because, so often, some of the flashier, newsworthy things get everybody's attention, but it's often the little things, these things that I call the tarp pulling moments, these unexpected kind of unglamorous things that aren't necessarily in your job description that make a huge difference. And I would imagine, based on what you're describing there, it's hard to even define a job description for someone in your role.
Absolutely. And I so appreciate the concept of pulling the tarp and everybody pulling the tarp, because I think that's so true for the work that we're doing locally. There's no one person who can be a silver bullet to all things. I'm really just in a lot of ways a facilitator for people's concerns about the community. Sometimes you just need to have a voice that you can trust to understand, well, how does this work? Who can I talk to? Which department handles this or that? And those little things really add up quickly. You have to have the folks who pick up the garbage. There have to be the folks who fill the potholes. There have to be the folks who take care of your parks and mow the lawns at your parks. And so your kids can play safely at the playground to make sure the equipment's up to speed. All of those roles are incredibly essential. And so you have to work as a team in the city to make it work.
There are so many things that we all just take for granted every single day that just happen, right? You show up at a little league field and the grass is mowed, and you show up at a basketball court and it's got nice cement, and you drive and it's smooth, hopefully, right? Hopefully it's smooth, right? There are so many little things that go into life that we so often take for granted. Now, there's so many things, right? This is where I want to dig in a little bit. There's so many things that pop up, right? You're out getting coffee, you're dropping one of your kids at school, you're walking to a meeting. Everybody in the community must have ideas. Emily, we need to fix this. Emily, we need to do that. Emily, we should do this instead of that. How do you manage all of that inflow of information, all these small things that to somebody might be the most important thing, but you need to weigh and balance?
Yes, absolutely. It's funny. I sort of joke that my professional background is in social work. I have an MSW. And in a lot of ways, I think social work is such an underrepresented profession within the universe of government, because one of the things that we learn to do is to be an empathic listener. You just have to listen to people sometimes. Honestly, I might not be able to solve the thing, but sometimes just the opportunity for a resident to be able to come up and be like, that really annoys me. Like, is there anything we can do about it? And just to build in an understanding of how did that come to be, or here's the context to that, so that they walk away with a different understanding. Sometimes that's all you needed. Or sometimes it does need to be something that has to be addressed, and there have to be a lot of voices. There's a lot of stakeholders when it comes to even something as small as a new building going up, of course. So you have to be able to take all those different voices and build consensus. What's going to be best for the community. So I feel like my social work profession actually has been really good for a number of different reasons, because it is true that the difficult and sometimes challenging thing about being in local government is people can find you at all times. If you're in your pajamas going to school because you're late, if you're picking up your coffee and you're cranky because you haven't had it yet, people want to talk when they want to talk.
I bet. So you said the word consensus there. So let's stay on that topic. We're so divided, right? Communities are divided. States are divided, countries are divided, the world is divided. So much of what we need to do, I think, is find consensus, find middle ground on issues. Listen, like you said there. How do we go about, in general, in any walk of life, in any aspect, business, community, government? How do you think about consensus and building consensus?
Sure. I mean, I would certainly underline the point I made already about sometimes people just want to be heard. You might not be able to do the thing they want you to do, but they just want the chance to have a voice in a conversation and know that they were validly considered. That's one thing. But certainly in a legislative body of 9 people, one person can't get anything done. You need 5 votes to get anything passed. So talk about an exercise and learning what it is to find a cooperative working environment. You got to get to 5 votes somehow. And a lot of that also is being driven by, the other side of that equation with the administration and the executive side of how our local government works. We have to work in cooperation with them, because if we don't, they won't necessarily execute the thing that's coming out of our legislative group. So it's a hard thing to do. It's a lot longer of a process, right? If you could sort of, make these executive decisions and just put your authority down and get it done, sure, it's maybe a faster process, but you don't have the buy-in of the community. So consensus building is a really important thing, especially at the municipal level, so that people feel like they had a voice in what's going on. They feel like they've been heard, they've been represented, and hopefully they also see their impact. I think one of the really incredible things is at the end of that process, sometimes we call it making the sausage. It's really not glamorous because you're just making sausage, but when you get to the end and you see this incredible product and you get to say, I had a hand in that, and I feel that way just being in the position I've been in. You go by an intersection and there's that stop sign that we requested as part of a study. Like, that feels great. I feel really happy about that stop sign. It's not glamorous. It's not going to be something, that people are going to put a billboard up about, but I feel very good about having made that difference.
What about when someone makes a valid suggestion, but it just doesn't work, or it's not right for the city at that time? How are you intentional about reading feedback back to the folks that maybe didn't get their way on a particular issue? How do you deal with that?
Sure. I think it's really important just to follow up with people. We get a lot of, information that kind of flows around, but communication is very difficult in a city of 60,000 people. So I take it upon myself to always make sure to follow up with someone about the conclusion. It may not be the thing they wanted, but I want to let them know how it was resolved. And that way they can feel included in the process. And maybe we need to look back at why that process was or was not working for someone and kind of, take a bigger level, big picture look at what's going on. And what can we learn from that? Maybe that wasn't the exact thing that they proposed, but we can make a change that kind of gets us to some middle ground. There's a lot of ways to look at it.
How do you reconcile the ups and downs, right? That on one given day, there's a lot of people that could be really happy with you, and
Yes.
there's a lot of people that might be really unhappy with you. How do you reconcile all that?
Listen, you're never going to make everybody happy, especially in local government. There's too many issues. There's too many people. There's a lot of different considerations. You're never going to make everyone happy. And once I kind of, digested that idea, because I have always been a people pleaser. I want everyone to be happy. I want everyone to walk away feeling like they got something. Once I sort of disavowed myself of this false idea that everyone was going to be, equally happy and, it's the perfect and being the enemy of the good. There's a point at which you have to be satisfied with good. And you focus on the good things. There's a lot of parts of municipal government that are not fun and they're mundane, or there's the part of this that frankly is really mean. Unfortunately, the good and the bad thing about social media is that it's a great tool to communicate. I love it for community organizing. I think it's really effective, but it also allows people to have these anonymous kind of troll-like personalities to say things that they would never say to your face, not in a million years, but behind a fake name and a fake profile, they'll let it loose and say all kinds of things about you. And you have to have a sense of self to kind of ignore all of that and really focus on the good things and the productive side of being involved.
It's such an interesting part of leadership. The fact that, great leaders, it cannot satisfy every constituent in many ways. Right. And I kind of went through this, throughout my career as my career was starting to take off a bit. Early in my career, I tell people I felt like I satisfied everyone. Every day I walked out of the office with my head held high, that I accomplished everything on my to-do list, that everything that was expected of me was responded to and dealt with. And then the further I got into my career, the more leadership and responsibility I had, I started walking out dejected because I said, I didn't accomplish half the things that people were expecting of me today, or I feel like I'm disappointing people because I'm not getting this done, or I haven't been able to move that along fast enough. And I shared that with a mentor, and he said, Andrew, welcome to a successful career. Mm-hmm. And his perspective was, and I've shared a little bit of this story before on this show, his perspective was the more responsibility you get, the challenges get tougher, mm-hmm. the diversity of thought and constituents that you're responsible for gets wider and increases, and the span of what you need to think about on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, is so dynamic that it's impossible to not please everybody. You have to kind of recalibrate your thinking that I might not be able to achieve perfection in the context of what I had thought about it before. Was that something that you feel like you've had to adjust to?
Absolutely. I mean, you have to just sort of figure out where your priorities are. And that's a hard thing to do in a space where, for me personally, I'm juggling being a mom, working full time, being a council person, wanting to be involved in my community with other interests, volunteering, whatever the case may be. You have to pick priorities in that universe. But then even when you focus on just the council role, for me, I have to also then look at, for all the things that people are asking of me, where are their wants and where are their needs? And especially in the context of everything going on with COVID, one of the, I think, silver linings of that is it made it all the more clear where people's true needs were. And during that crisis, and so I think we're still sort of in it, really, we haven't come through all the way. That really put everything into perspective about what was the most important things that we needed to get done. And I think it said a lot about the functioning of local government. And I think Hoboken especially really rose to the occasion of being there for the constituents who are here, whether it was setting up testing sites, whether it was vaccination sites, whether it was just, guidance from a public health perspective. That really kind of cleared the field of where that universe of wants and needs had to end up falling.
You sure did. And Hoboken made national news, global news, when it was, the first, if not one of the very first cities in the United States to shut down restaurant and bars at the beginning of the crisis. That must have been a decision that was not taken lightly. How did you all process that and essentially, come to that decision that at that moment it was the right thing to do? At the time, a very, very bold, progressive decision, given that a lot of cities and states hadn't taken those measures yet.
Absolutely. Hoboken was the first actually to close restaurants and bars as we were kind of understanding the true impact of COVID. March of 2019, things are kind of starting to, 2020, things are kind of starting to become clear. Schools were making decisions about how long to close for. They were kind of preparing families. And I remember having conversations with our Mayor Bala, about what were we going to do? What was going to happen? Broadway closed. And on the same day that Broadway decided to close, our schools decided to close for 2 weeks. Everyone thought it would be sort of this temporary, let's just shut it all down and see what happens. And there was concerns from the business community, rightfully so. How is this going to impact us? And we were kind of talking about, as a group, there were a number of us who were all on a call talking about, well, maybe if we did 50% capacity, maybe if we did 25% capacity, how do we balance this so that people have this sense of, we can survive through this crisis, but we're also protecting public health. And literally the next day, I'll, never forget it. The mayor called back and he basically said, this is a crisis and people's lives are on the line. We have to close. We have to close. We don't have a choice. And that's the first day that all of our bars and restaurants were closed. It was March 16th. I won't forget. And it was just a really, I think all of us felt the weight of that decision because we knew that that was not ideal for people's economic livelihood. That was going to have a tremendous impact on our businesses. But then when it came to human health and human life, what are you supposed to do? You can't jeopardize anyone or risk anyone's lives in that way. And that was his decision. Talk about executive leadership in moments of crisis. You have to have the clarity of thought to determine a really hard decision and to make it and to go through with it. And, it got picked up very quickly at the national level. Some of the science community certainly was supportive and quickly followed suit across the state and then across the country.
You talked about conference calls and meetings and all kinds of conversations, some of which, you clearly remember so vividly.
Yeah.
When you think back upon that initial, first few weeks of the crisis, what, there must have been a lot of tarp pulling going on, right? A lot of people
100%.
wearing a lot of different hats. Talk about that experience, as you think about it. I mean, relatively early in your life as a public official.
Absolutely. No one had a guidebook. No one knew what this was going to look like and how would this unfold. We were having conference calls constantly with the mayor's office. The city council was having conference calls with the administration to learn how we could be helpful. So many pull the tarp moments. There was a point at which there was an expected peak in the spread in that early phase. And we actually ended up telling all of our senior citizens to stay home. We gave them, we have several senior buildings across the city. And it's sort of, a dorm-like setup. So when you think about spaces where people could quickly have a spread of COVID, those were really vulnerable populations. We actually, for several weeks, started to deliver groceries and meals to people's doors in those senior buildings because we were so worried that in that peak time of spread, that they would be the most vulnerable. And we wanted to make sure that they were staying home, staying safe, and we were just delivering everything every day. So every morning, a crew of us, volunteers, it didn't matter if you were the mayor, if you were a council person, if you were somebody who was just living in town, college students from Stevens, we all got together and we would assemble all the kits. Everyone had PPE on so that we were like fully ready. And everyone was assembling meals and we would drop them off at people's doors. We would check and make sure people were okay. We would ask if they needed any testing. It was an incredible effort. And I don't know of any other community that did that sort of, support to ensure that people's health was being looked out for.
That's it. That's incredible. Are there, when you think about, some of those moments and it's always interesting to me how sometimes people shine the brightest, in our darkest times. Right. And this is certainly something that nobody ever wants to go through again. But when you look back on this, I would imagine that there has to be some level of pride that you just feel from being part of an experience like that.
Mm-hmm. I think Hoboken just leads the way in so many different instances, but especially with everything with COVID, it felt like we were just making really forward-thinking decisions to ensure that people felt safe and felt protected. Every day we were sending a citywide email out through our alert system, just giving people the data. A lot of times people just felt in the dark. They didn't know what was happening locally. You'd turn on the news and certainly you'd hear about how things were happening at a national level, but our health department actually worked with our communications team to make sure we were sharing that data with all of our residents daily. And I remember the point at which things sort of started to, kind of the gas came off a little bit and like people were slowing down, things were kind of getting more handled. And people would say to me, I didn't get a nixle alert today. What's happening? I didn't hear the data today. And, you kind of got that sense of, wow, people were really relying on hearing from us as officials about what was happening so that they could know where they were in things. I just can't say enough about how this city really led in so many different ways to get people through crisis. And for me personally, it was very empowering at a time where I think a lot of people otherwise felt really helpless. One of the most difficult things, certainly looking at what's happened with the impact of COVID, is people's mental health and just feeling like they were isolated and they didn't have connections with others. I actually had the opportunity, because of the role I had, to be out and to do outreach and to support others and feel like I was making a difference. And it's, that's why we get into elected office, hopefully, is because you want to do something good in your community. So at a time that was otherwise so dark, it really gave me personally such gratification to feel like I was doing something productive.
Was there a point that you think back on that was unquestionably the low point, in terms of, a meeting or a day or an experience that you had that you felt like at that point maybe was rock bottom?
I think there were a few of those different times. A lot of them were sort of chaos driven. I was like doing virtual school with my two daughters. They're young. At the time they were 5 and 8, and trying to figure out how we were managing them. My husband's trying to work from home and his job. I'm trying to work from home for my job, but then also thinking about the needs of this community and trying to prioritize that above all else, because in instances like our senior citizens, it was really a matter of life and death in a lot of cases. And certainly some of those early days of hearing the numbers, I was really worried about the capacity of our hospitals to manage the really truly the most sick cases for people who needed ventilators and needed really intensive care. We would have these calls and we would literally count how many people are in the ICU, how many ventilators do we have, how many beds are open, what other hospital capacity looks like. Those are things I never thought I would have to have a conversation about, certainly not in that kind of role of things. And it sort of blows my mind in a lot of ways that we've come from there, that we've been able to get such a handle on things. The vaccine has rolled out, we've come so far in such a short amount of time, but there's still so much that we don't know. And it's a really scary thing to know that every day something completely new could happen and come out of left field, and you just have no idea what's going to happen. And you make every decision each day based on the best knowledge that you have. And that knowledge may completely shift the next day. And you just have to roll with it. You just had to be resilient and just keep coming back for it.
You've told me that one of the biggest surprises for you about public office in this role is the power of your voice and understanding the power of your voice, and that what everybody says matters. But when you say something in a role like you're in, it carries a lot more weight. How have you adapted to that and I guess changed?
Sure. I think I completely underestimated that at first. It took me a little while to realize how meaningful my words could be. It was something small. I said something to someone and it kind of within a few days, it came back to me from somebody completely different who had heard it definitely as something attributable to me. And I tried to sort of build the chain to figure out how it had progressed. And that was the first time I really understood the power of the things that you would say. But as I kind of became more comfortable with that and I realized the influence I could have, one of the things I tried to always do was actually to use my social media accounts and what I was doing during my daily life to communicate what was going on. So something that was important to me was supporting our small businesses as we were kind of getting a handle on COVID and things were opening back up, or, restaurants were trying to pivot and do takeout business more so because they couldn't have people in house. I would take a picture of picking up dinner from, the place down the block, because I wanted people to see that I was going out and I was, patronizing these businesses and that it was safe to do so. And this is such a great thing, and to kind of celebrate it and to use my platform and my voice to show that there were ways that people could kind of safely re-enter. I remember, a friend of mine reached out and said, it looks like that things are okay. People were all over the spectrum in terms of their comfort level. And this particular person had literally not left her home. She was not going out. And she saw that I had been going out to pick up, coffee or a meal from a restaurant. And she said, I saw that you were doing that, and it made me feel like I could safely do that. And that was just, it was really, again, another affirmation of, wow, our voices can mean so much.
You got into this role, Emily, like you said earlier, because you wanted to make a difference. You had a passion. You felt like you had this unique perspective and needed to lend your voice. For people listening, how do they find their voice and passions? How do they know when it's time to act?
Sure. I think there's so much to be gained just by getting active and paying attention to what's going on. And sometimes that first step is a hard one. Don't get me wrong. You have to figure out and navigate kind of locally where things are happening, whether it's a community meeting, whether it's going to, some sort of like a council meeting or, some sort of park meeting. It's hard to sort of make that initial first step of getting to that sort of a group and sort of putting yourself outside your comfort zone. But it honestly doesn't take much if you kind of keep going down that path. You show up to your Board of Education meeting, you're showing up to council meetings, and you start paying attention. You start to get a sense of the cadence and the flow and what's going on and what's on the agenda and what are people talking about. And you quickly really develop a sense of, I think I could fit in this. I think I could do something about this. I could be useful in this conversation. I'm always so grateful when, people who are new and haven't participated will come up and they'll say, hey, this was my first meeting. I'm really interested. You happen to mention that there's, a redevelopment project going on in that neighborhood. And that's where I live. What can I do? Who can I talk to? I'd really like to know. A lot of times I think our role as elected officials is really to be a connector in the community because there's so many things happening, especially in a city of 60,000 people. And sometimes it's just managing to get those two people together who are doing two really complementary things that would be amazing if they teamed up. And you're the person who gets to team them up, and what gratification that is and how amazing to watch that sort of blossom. But I think a lot of times it's just, find the connector in your community, reach out to somebody who seems to be connected to other things and saying, I'm really interested in, this park. I love gardening. I want to do more. Is there somebody I can volunteer with? There's nothing that we love to hear more than somebody who wants to spend their time supporting something that we do. It's easy to take that and say, yeah, let me help you run with that. It's wonderful. I love those opportunities.
Look, I think one of the great things about leadership is that you never know if you're making the right decision or the wrong decision. You're just trying to make the best possible decision and act in the best way possible given the circumstances. Mm-hmm. And people may agree with you, Emily. They may disagree with you, Emily. They may agree with the mayor. They may disagree with the mayor. One thing that I don't think anybody can disagree with is the fact that you guys were working your tails off. You always work your tails off. And through the thick of COVID, you guys were leading from the front, working hard, doing the best you possibly could with the information that you had. That there is no question. So thank you so much for pulling the tarp every single day, doing what you do, and for spending some time with me this week. Take care and keep pulling the tarp, Emily.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about the city that I love. Hoboken is a special place, and we're doing our best to keep Hoboken punching above its weight.
All right. I'm going to come visit one of these days. All right. We'll have to talk soon.
Absolutely. Thanks.